Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure I'm all set to get started here.
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
Wonderful.
We'll wait a couple more people to join up here, and then we'll go ahead and kick it off and get started.
Great. Thank you. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. I will wait for your clear as to when to get started.
I'll kick it off here in a sec.
Thank you.
Already got Gary raising his hand. Gary, you want to put your question in the Q&A?
Bless you.
I'll go ahead and kick it off here. Well, welcome to our coffee tasting / brewing masterclass. This is sponsored by Seclor Security, and we're going to give them a few minutes to talk here in a second. With us today, I've got Sam Peyton. He's the Education and Quality Control Director at Texas Coffee Traders here in Austin. And today, we're not just brewing the perfect cup, we're exploring the history and nuances of coffee. So whether you're a seasoned aficionado or new to the art of brewing, we'll guide you through all the essentials and variables from right beans to temperatures to what kind of water, the whole 9 yards on that, so we can kind of elevate your coffee experience. So with that, I'll pass it over to Zach with Seclor Security, and he can talk about their data security offering.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Sullivan, VP of Enterprise Sales for Seclor. Really appreciate everybody's time. Cheers. I hope you're enjoying your coffee this morning. I know that I am. Just a quick introduction to myself. I have been with Seclor now for just over 7 years. I've been leading the way for data-centric security, been speaking at many different cybersecurity summits and cybersecurity conferences on the topic of data protection for many years, and really enjoy the opportunity to speak with you here. I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to dive in quickly, and please, at the end, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. Just a little bit of background in the company. We've been around for 13 years. We are focused on enterprises in I'd say 3 different areas. Main areas of focus would be manufacturing, of course, finance, financial services, insurance, in healthcare. As you can see on the screen right now, there's many different logos here. Certainly Ford, American Express, and so many others that you're seeing here on the screen are my customers directly. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the use cases, really. Why are these companies looking at Seclor? What do we do? What are our core competencies? What are the use cases that other organizations in the data security space are not meeting that are prompting these organizations to come to us? So we're on a mission to protect organizations' most sensitive data. And just to take a step back, what do I mean by data? Well, certainly what I mean by data is unstructured data, data that could be flowing through emails, it could be in file folders, but really that whole unstructured data world. And there's a lot of things that have changed in this world here, certainly over the past decade, post-pandemic, right? The amount of third parties that organizations are working with has increased drastically. And that probably is one of the main reasons for our growth spurt that we're going through right now. We actually grew 50% last year, both in terms of revenue and in terms of number of employees. We're looking to double that again as we go into this next fiscal year. So if I look at the numbers right now, right, and I'm going back to 2022, but this trend's continued 2023, it's continuing in 2024. Now we are both at a record of spend at upwards of about $20 billion per year over year. And at the same time, the number of breaches keeps rising. What does that tell me? In a lot of ways, it tells me it's not a spend problem. Right? I think we can continue to spend money on the same endpoint security controls, on the same network security controls. And I think we can still end up in the same place that we are today. I think the mindset needs to change because the way that the data is moving is changing. Number of third parties is changing. The way the volume, the velocity of data continues to change. So how do we get ahead of that, right? In the way that I really think about this internally, in the way that I think so many organizations are moving towards is, what's my end goal? Well, my end goal is to protect the data. And that's a fairly simple statement, right? Of course, we want to all protect data. But if I'm going to say that, I need to really make that end goal protecting my data. And that can't just be constrained to a certain corporate boundary. It can't just be constrained to a certain device. Right? You really need to look at data protection holistically and say, if I'm going to have my data protected, it needs to be protected internally. It needs to be protected externally. It needs to be protected when it goes to my third parties. I need to make sure that I'm content aware, meaning I understand that data, but then I also have a level of data protection that's now going to travel with that data, wherever that data is traveling. And so we're seeing this trend right now of organizations looking to protect their data persistently, looking to make sure that they can audit that data and they can control that data wherever it goes. I mentioned a couple of different companies out there, and I also mentioned that a lot of our customers in the financial services or manufacturing spaces, in these companies have a couple of different challenges. And I think these challenges have changed the way that data protection officers, chief information security officers, and really the role of the data security professional, right? If we look back a decade, if I'm stopping from infiltration and exfiltration prevention, I'm really doing a good job. But today, because of the amount of third parties working, the amount of velocity of data, both internally, who has the rights to get to those data internally? How do I change those when somebody's roles change or change permissions to the data? I think the role of the security professional has now changed to include protecting data persistently in a way that they were responsible for their internal data only, right? The day of the NDA is dead. If I'm going to share data outside of my organization, there's regulatory compliance requirements that are pushing me to make sure that I can also always audit that data, regardless of the device or the network or the application. So we want to look at data protection, but we want to look at data protection both within and then outside of those corporate networks. Where's this data traveling today, right? Well, certainly there's a whole supply chain. We can't just lock it down to a simple file type, right? It's not just Word files. It's not just Excel files. There's image files, text files, PDF files. So how do I make sure that I'm aligning myself with a company that can not just handle certain file types, but can handle the breadth and depth of different file types? Also, it can't just be locked down to a certain device, meaning my laptop on a corporate network. Many different executives, some of them only use iPads, only use their iPhones, only use their Android phones. Then you also look at where can this data travel to different applications, right? Am I using Box? Am I using Dropbox? Am I using SharePoint? So being able to have persistent data security controls that stay with the data, regardless of the device or the network or the application or the cloud, has become really powerful. And I want to mention there's a lot of different perimeter-based security controls. We're not saying that people should change their strategy for perimeter-based security controls to not have endpoint security or network security or cloud security. But I think it's realizing where the gaps are with these different security tools out there today. And if I look at the landscape, what are organizations vulnerable to? Well, they're vulnerable to data theft, certainly data exfiltration, IP theft. If I'm a manufacturing company, I'm working with suppliers and fabricators, maybe I need to go out to bid. Maybe I'm working with maybe I'm going for patents and trademarks and they do share sensitive formulas, et cetera, outside of that corporate boundary, not just within the teams where I want to lock it down to certain R&D teams, and then lock down what can they do with the file? Can they print it? Can they edit it? Can they screen share it? Can they print that file? We can extend those privileges, not only internally, but past the corporate boundary. And then also we can give organizations the ability to audit that data for regulatory compliance requirements. When I look at financial institutions, I look at insurance institutions, I look at so many other institutions out there and so many different firms. There's regulatory compliance requirements that are really pushing them in the direction of always being able to audit that sensitive data, always remaining in control in that sensitive data. And why is that? Well, it's because the number of third-party breaches has continued to rise. And what I can say is this: if possession doesn't equal control, meaning I've shared something with somebody and they have that within their email, for example, but I can control what they can do with that file and I can revoke that access at any time. I can also audit that data. Again, possession doesn't need to equal control. It's a really powerful statement. I think for a long time, when we've shared information with somebody outside of that organization, we've accepted the fact that they get to do whatever they want to do with that file. And I don't think that that should be the case. I think that organizations really need to always remain in control of that data, and especially to help them meet regulatory non-compliance requirements or IP theft. How did we get here today? Right? I mentioned at the beginning, the end goal is to get to data protection, right? And it's not just data protection internally, it's data protection anywhere that data travels. So many organizations have invested in CASB or DLP tools or classification tools over the last few years. And I think it's a great strategy. But I think there's also gaps, right? If I'm a CASB tool or a DLP tool and I'm sending data outside of that corporate perimeter, once I send that data outside of that corporate perimeter, I need to make a yes/no decision. Can that data leave, yes or no? When that data goes out, I've lost full visibility and control. Classification tools, yes, I want to be content aware. I want to know what the classification label is. But also at the same time, if I'm going to have a classification strategy, I need to map that to a data protection strategy. And that data protection strategy should travel with that data anywhere it goes. So simply based on either the content of that data, meaning it's PII data, that PII data has to leave. We're going to make a call to Seclor. Seclor is going to protect this data. We're going to have the ability to control this data and audit this data now wherever it travels. That can take place today. It's the automation that's really evolved the area of that which we fit in, which from a core competency standpoint is enterprise digital rights management. We have classification components, and we have integrations with other data-centric security tools that are data aware, like a DLP, a CASB tool, or a classification tool. This is that next level of data protection. If we look at where we were right now, yes, I want to be content aware, but then I also want to have a strategy that's going to be persistent controls of this data. There's many different use case examples out there. Many of these companies that we're working with today are currently using us to meet these different requirements, making sure that my data is protected in the cloud, protecting intellectual property as I share that data, adhering to compliance regulations and regulatory compliance requirements around NIST, GDPR, New York Data Privacy Act, CCPA, et cetera. Again, possession no longer has to equal access. And so we're going to have encryption on that data. We're going to make sure that there's dynamic granular access controls, which is really who can do what when in the file, what, when, and where on that file. Can they print it? Can they edit it? Can they screen share that file? There's dynamic watermarking that stays with the file wherever it travels. There's real-time revocation. And a lot of these different things that you're seeing on the screen differentiate us from a lot of our main competitors. And what I'd say is if you're using, you have an E3, E5 license, you're using Microsoft, you might wonder, why would I look at Seclor, right? Why would I look at a company who's doing something similar? And what I'd say now is 95% of our customers are E3, E5 licensed Microsoft customers have used Purview. They're all deciding to use Seclor because we can fill gaps in that data security platform. So I'm going to end now. I think I know I'm coming up on the end of my time. I want to thank everybody so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Good deal. Thanks, Zach.
Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
All right, with that, let me get this back over to Sam. Sam's got a presentation as well we're going to throw up here, so should be able to see both of these things. All right, you're up.
Hey y'all, I'm Sam. I work at Texas Coffee Traders, where I'm the Director of Education and Quality Control. So I teach baristas from all around the city how to do their job better and also help new and prospective business owners succeed. We primarily do business with small businesses, but since our time in Austin, since 1994, we've cultivated about 550 active wholesale customers, which means we roast about 11,000 to 15,000 pounds per week. All that to say, quite a lot of coffee goes through what we do. And today I hope to just kind of share how each part of the supply chain plays a role in the final product. So we will be taking a deep dive in the industry from every facet, from seed to cup. And I do have a little disclaimer on the bottom there that some of these things change as we learn more about coffee and things. So the anatomy of the coffee cherry, if we take open, a lot of people don't know, coffee grows on a shrub. That shrub will be about 2 meters in height at its maturity, and it will produce fruit that looks like cherries. It's classified as a drupe, so similar to like a pear, something like that. But inside of that fruit, we have 2 coffee beans that make up the pit of that fruit. Depending on how you process the coffee will radically change the way that the coffee tastes, which is really important. So we'll go over the many different ways that you can process coffee and that kind of thing. So the outside layer is our pulp. Under that, a sticky mucilage layer. Then beneath that, a protective layer like silver skin. And then the really hard green coffee bean. So what we get as we import green coffee from farmers are these really dense, hard beans. They kind of look like kidney beans. And they smell anywhere from really fruity to really grassy, hay-like, depending on the process. So all this to say, coffee is an agricultural product. So where does it come from? Next slide, please. Coffee comes from, as I said, it's the pit of that fruit on flowering shrubs. That fruit will, once planted in the ground, it takes coffee plants 2 to 3 years to reach maturity. And over one harvest season, one plant will produce 1 pound of coffee. And this is all talking about Arabica coffee. But it is really interesting to know that a tremendous amount of labor goes into the cultivation of coffee, and why engaging in specialty coffee, buying specialty coffee from local roasters is really important, is because you're actively engaging in markets that are paying above the commodity price for coffee, a hand over fist. So fair trade, direct trade are things that you can look for in branded coffee, and even going and talking to your roaster and seeing where they get their coffee can be very valuable, because coffee is unfortunately linked with exploitative labor, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But doing business directly with the farmer is one way that we can help with that process. And coffee quality is greatly impacted by when the coffee cherries are picked. So that means they are incentivized for picking when they're the most ripe, the brightest red. And if they cultivate the cherries and dry them out and make sure that they're uniform, they receive a much higher price per pound for their product. So that's really important. And we will go into how to brew coffee, all that stuff. I know you're probably itching to get going. This is just kind of my way of introducing you to what coffee is, where it comes from, and the history before we dive into drinking it, because we'll be talking about a lot of stuff. So we'll breeze through this, though, I promise.
Yeah, there's timeline.
The timeline, and you can just, when you bring it up, you can just put it all on here. Thank you. So 500 AD is the apocryphal story where coffee was discovered. The story goes that, and someone from Aromia at the time was watching his goats, found that the goats got hyper and started dancing, and he realized that they'd eaten the cherries off the shrub. So that's the story of how coffee was discovered. The most important thing that I'll teach you today, something that a lot of people do not know, is that the only place that Arabica coffee, the high altitude coffee, grows wild is Ethiopia. It's imported everywhere else it grows. So in 1450, it makes its way to Yemen. 1536, we see the first plantation pop up in Yemen. And then in 1660, another apocryphal story that's fun, a Sufi monk traveling through the region finds the coffee plantation, and at the time what was Arabia Felix, Yemen, and he steals coffee cherries in his beard and smuggles them to India. The Dutch get their hands on the same coffee a few years later, and they take seedlings with them out to colonize Indonesia. So Indonesia is the first place that coffee, that Europeans are starting to consume coffee from. 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam gifts one plant to the King of France, the products of which are used to cultivate coffee in the Caribbean. In the early 1900s, coffee makes its way back to Eastern Africa, into countries such as Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Burundi, and Kenya. So if you've had coffee from Kenya, it's only been growing in that region for 100 years. That's very profound. And then our next slide, lovely, we have our coffee travel itinerary. So it just kind of goes through each step of the journey. Before the 1500s, the only place that coffee Arabica grew was Ethiopia. As it makes its way around the globe, it starts to adopt some of the characteristics of the soil and changes the way that the coffee tastes. So each growing region will radically impact the way that the coffee tastes. We can make some baseline assumptions based on where your coffee's coming from, what it's going to taste like. On that next slide, different coffee species. Some larger font for those with bad eyes. Coffea robusta is the taxonomical description for the species of coffee. Robusta grows at lower altitudes. It grows much more prolifically. So instead of 1 pound per harvest season, it's putting out maybe 4 to 5 pounds per harvest season. And this is what was used more often than not in instant coffees in the early 1900s. This is still something that is used in Italian espresso. It's very prolific in Asia as a cash crop. And it's gotten a bad rap throughout history. So there's a lot of work being done. While we don't source any Robusta, there's a lot of work being done elsewhere to really elevate the price per pound for Robusta as well. What we source is Arabica. It'll grow at 1,000 meters plus above sea level. It's going to have more acidity. It's going to have a lot less caffeine, but because of the less caffeine, more complex flavors. So we're going to be able to detect much more nuance in our Arabica. And at the higher elevations, it can bring out even more acidity, even more sweetness. So where it grows is on this coffee belt. We call it the bean belt. And we'll think about it as the line of latitude north and south of the equator, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. That makes up our tropical region around the world. So with that, the highest or the farthest north that it'll typically grow is maybe Mexico, and the Sudan. It does grow a little bit, and in India as well. And as far south as maybe Brazil and some of those Indonesian countries, East Timor is pretty far south latitudinally. So all this to say, it's a tropical plant and it really likes high elevation. I have a question, and I don't know if this is a Q&A, but if anybody can just guess, looking at that big map, what the biggest exporter of coffee in the world is. You almost said it.
Nah, I'm not gonna guess. Puerto Rico. No, I know it's not.
So by landmass, it becomes obvious Brazil puts out about, I think, they export $1 billion in coffee. So it's $1 billion of their GDP is coffee, which is really, really cool. So next slide here. Yeah, we can thumb through that, sorry. What affects the taste of coffee? Our growing region. So where did it come from? How it was processed and the degree of roast. Other factors will include variety, soil content, altitude, and rainfall. We're not going to go into all of that, but it is really important for you to know variety refers to the plant and the products of the plant. Varietal refers to the beverage created. So a wine, it is an adequate description to call a glass of wine a varietal. It is not, unless it's a brewed cup of coffee. So that's just my own, I'm being an over descriptive nerd. So a crop from any particular farm will necessarily taste different than the harvest from the previous year. This is due to micro fluctuations in all the things that it takes to grow coffee. Nevertheless, we can make some base assumptions based on where a coffee's from. So Ethiopian coffee tends to be floral, fruit forward, can be on the spicy side of things, and a much higher acidity simply because of the altitude. Indonesia will tend to be a fuller bodied, low acidity, earthy, kind of smoky sometimes. Mossy is another good word for it. Central and South America tends to be either nutty, chocolatey, or caramely sweet. You can also get some really high dollar Central and South America that is really fruity. And then Eastern Africa tends to be fruity, bright, peppery, citrusy, and with a really high acidity. So the main three processing methods. A natural process is where we take the fruit as it is, all of it is intact, and we dry it out with the fruit on. What that does is doesn't allow for a fermentation period to take place necessarily. So there's not going to be much acidity that is created during that process. But what is occurring is there's a physical breakdown of the walls of that coffee. So it's going to absorb a lot of those fruity flavors. So a natural processed coffee means that it was dried with the fruit on, and it's going to be really fruity tasting. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend trying a natural process from a local roaster. Washed processed coffees are the most common. That's where they take off the fruit. They wash off the residue left behind, and then they ferment the coffee in tanks for 72 hours. That fermentation is where we're converting sugars into alcohols and then into acetic acid and everywhere in between. So they've perfected the washing of the coffee, the fermentation of the coffee, to where it creates the right level of acidity. And there's a lot of work that goes into these kind of way before it gets roasted to elevate the price per pound. It will have higher acidity than the other processes that we're discussing because of that fermentation that we just talked about taking place. Honey process is where they take off the fruit, but they leave that sticky residue left behind. They let it dry in that sticky residue, which does allow for more fermentation. Not as much as a washed, but it's going to have a little bit of the fruity as well as a different kind of acidity developed. So here we can find more lactic acidity, which is where we get our creamy mouthfeel from. So very
We have
interesting.
a question from the audience.
Yes, audience.
Some are washed with chemicals.
Some are washed with chemicals. I don't think that that's very prevalent or common. And we're discussing what we're talking about is specialty coffee, and specialty coffee on a scale from 1 to 100, it is the highest quality coffee that you can buy, and it just means it scored 80 plus on a scale from 1 to 100. Anything below that is called gourmet or premium, which is kind of interesting. So those coffees, those lower priced coffees, very likely can have some weird stuff going on. But in the specialty realm, it's typically,
if you care at all, you're not doing it.
yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure that there are like to be frank, maybe some solutions that help with the demucilage, like taking stuff off, but it's not gonna be with a chemical unless you're trying to decaffeinate it. And we don't use the chemical kind of decaffeination, but there are some that use acetate. Yeah, if you ask a question, I will answer it very thoroughly.
There we go.
Processing. So this shoeless hippie is our owner. RC started roasting coffee in 1981 in Montana. He was kind of responsible for a specialty coffee or access to good coffee available in Montana. So this is him raking coffee in our farm in Costa Rica that he helped the people who worked the farm buy the land and put a cooperative on the farm. So they all benefit from that. But the two methods of drying coffee, you can sun dry them in the cherries. You rake constantly for uniformity, and then mechanically dried, they'll do that in drums. And here we are. Thank you for your question. Decaffeination. So we only use water processed coffee. Caffeine is, as a molecule, water soluble. So if you take green coffee, which has a lot of readily available caffeine, and you submerge it in a tank, and then you add water and let the caffeine leach out from the green coffee beans into the water, then suck that water through carbon filters, capturing the caffeine, they'll then take that free-base caffeine and send it off to Rockstar, Monster. So if you ever see green coffee extract in your drink, that's where it comes from. Decaffeinating green coffee. So this slide says they're steamed. That's another way to do it. And then there's also some people use lye or acetate. So the difference in degree roast, and I'm just going to pick up the pace, but at our light roast, the coffee beans haven't physically changed as much as they're going to as we roast darker. So green coffee, when it goes into the roaster, is going to be really small and really dense. As we roast it, it's going to expand and lose weight. The steam, or all of the moisture, 10 to 12% of its weight is moisture, is going to go away. So every time we're roasting coffee, we're losing weight. Every time we're roasting coffee, we're losing between 15 to 20% of the weight that we put in. So that's something to consider. Obviously, less weight is lost on a light roast. So 3 things that we'll talk about that'll be very important when we get to our French press is there's always going to be acidity, sweetness, and bitterness. It's always going to come out in that order. The same thing is happening as we roast coffee. So a light roast is going to have the most acidity out of all these other profiles, simply because we haven't destroyed it. So the more you roast coffee, the more you're destroying acidity. If you don't like acidity, try a darker roast. That can be very helpful. You kind of have to know what to expect. For our sugars, we haven't yet caramelized our sugars much. So we get like a really bright, pure cane sweetness. And we haven't tainted the regional characteristics that are expressed in a light roast with a roasty flavor. And I use tainted in quotes because it's all about preference. It's all about what you like. No one should ever tell you what you should like. At a medium roast, we have fully caramelized our sugars. We've destroyed a bit of our acidity. And our regional characteristics are now enhanced by that roasted coffee flavor. We also have the possibility of bitter compounds getting into our brew. We'll talk about why here in a sec. Dark roast, depending on where you are, a dark roast these days might look lighter than it did 20 years ago. That's not the case for us. We've kind of stuck to our guns. We roast the way that we have since the 90s in very intentional ways, but dark and oily is how we go with our dark roast, even with those high dollar green coffees. And that makes us a bit unique. So in the dark roast, we destroyed almost all the acidity. Our sugars have darkened to become more like molasses. And our regional characteristics are very much accompanied or maybe even slightly muted by our roasted coffee flavor. And then an Italian roast, just what we call it, the darkest roast possible. That's where we're burning the sugars, low acidity, molasses sweetness, that kind of thing. As we taste coffee, first thing that we're gonna do, and now we get to the hands-on. So open up your bag of coffee and just smell. Now we got plenty of time. So we open up our bag of coffee and smell, kind of take in. I have the same coffee that we sent you guys. Smells really nice. Maybe milk chocolatey on the nose, something like that. This is an over description, but basically this is the same coffee 101 that I give to all my new and prospective wholesale customers. This is what I give to all my new employees. And so this just helps people describe what you're smelling, what you're tasting. The two types of acidity that are going to be found most commonly in coffee are either malic or citric. There's also tartaric, but malic is going to be green apples and some berries and on the like green fruit kind of thing. Whereas citric is going to be either oranges, lemons, limes, or grapefruit. So determining what kind of acidity can be fun. If you ever see that on the bag, that's what they're referring to.
I got a question for you from
Yes.
the audience. Does blonde, light, medium, dark roast, etc., have any bearing on the caffeine level or just the taste?
That's a great question. So if we were to analyze each coffee bean, the answer would be yes, there is more physical caffeine in a single light roast bean than a single dark roast bean because it's lost, or the dark roast bean has lost more of its weight. However, that if we're using weight, not volume, a light roast bean is necessarily much more dense and heavier than a dark roast bean. So if we were to equal out the weight of one light roast bean, it would probably take 2 or 3 dark roast beans to equal the weight. So the caffeine difference becomes negligible if we're using weight. If we were to fill this cup up with light roast beans and brew with it, and then use the same cup and fill it up with dark roast beans and brew with it, there would be much more caffeine in the light roast because we used so much more weight of coffee, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So it's very important weighing versus that kind of thing. Our sweetness from pure cane, brown sugar, caramel, molasses. Basically, what happens to sugar when you put it in a pan and leave the heat on? Well, we have it start to caramelize, we start to brown, start to caramelize, becomes molasses, and then burns. Principle or flavor is just what does the coffee taste like, and then how does it finish? That's the flavor that's going to remain in our mouth. I have a little brief snippet of our flavor wheel, how we, as coffee professionals, will use this kind of help ourselves define or describe what we're tasting. We have a very comprehensive sensory lexicon that we have access to that allows us to just kind of, and in a very subjective way, make flavor calls. So if you look at our website, each coffee has a very adequate taste description. And that's where this comes from, is we've very, very diligently for our 100 coffees tasted them, described them, so that y'all have a little bit easier time navigating what is this coffee going to taste like? Because I don't expect you to remember all this. Coffee is one of the top 10 globally traded commodities, so this creates a substantial demand for both farmland and labor. This is where fair trade comes in. Coffee traders as an entity was one of the first, if not the first, fair trade relationships concerning coffee in North America. This is at the end of fair trade, or fair trade is starting in Europe in the late 80s. Early 90s, our owner goes down and helps 17 families who are cultivating land, coffee for a Don, to buy out the land from out from under the Don. That's still where Cafe Monteverde is. We buy over half of what they produce annually. We bought literally millions of pounds of coffee from them at about $4 over the fair trade price. And that is what sustainability and direct trade really means and really can look like. And this isn't something that we necessarily, we could definitely market it better or market it more and talk about it more, but it's really more of a, we have a beneficial relationship with these human beings that cultivate the thing that we enjoy and all those things. So organic coffees are grown without harmful pesticides. Sometimes these coffees are shade grown or grown alongside other indigenous plant life. Monteverde is a great example of this. They have over half of their farm is still under forest. It's in a forest preserve and grows alongside. So coffee grows under the trees. That's really good for biodiversity. So each year, about 2,000 students will go visit Life Monteverde, which is where they can learn about sustainable living, agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and how to perpetuate life on Earth. So it's really cool stuff. If you ever have the ability to travel to Costa Rica, I would highly recommend visit Monteverde. Very valuable. They've got a couple cafes now. I think the generator on the cafe runs on the methane from the pigs. So it's like very state of the art, but also, jungle type stuff, which is really cool. Any questions on that litany that I just threw at you? I'm here to overwhelm you. I mean, this got to be a nice break from the action, though, right?
Yes.
So as we wind down, we got about 15 minutes left. We're gonna pull out our French press that we sent you. Hopefully you've got your water hot and ready. If not, you won't be missing much if you need to catch up. But really and truly, depending on what brew method we're using, it's gonna be just important to know how much coffee you're going to use. So I've got Josh sending y'all my brew guide, and I'll also attach my intro to brew methods just for your benefit, because I think it would be something fun for any interested coffee folks to read. I've got about 13 different brew methods in there with recipes, and hopefully that would just be something that you'd get something out of. But for French press, this is invented in the 30s. Obviously, it's just a beaker. So made a frame for a beaker. And I'm gonna just really quick go through what makes a French press unique. So if we take our filter off and look, I'm also gonna teach you how to clean it because I'm a nice guy. We can unscrew this bottom, and don't unscrew it all the way, but we can unscrew the bottom and you can see how it's kind of put together. We have a mesh screen and then a spiral plate at the top. So that mesh screen, we hold it up to the light, you can see the size of them holes. So with a French press, we're always going to use the coarsest grind.
It's not letting me stop sharing here.
No. Okay.
Don't want to share.
So the reason that we have the coarser grind is because a finer grind would necessarily clog them holes. So a few things, right? Having filtered water. I think that we sent out a mandate to get filtered water before doing this, but basically having filtered water is better than using distilled water or using hard water. So basically 80 to 150 parts per million is what we shoot for as coffee pros and all that. Nestle Pure Life works really well for brewing coffee, oddly enough. And just don't use any distilled water, because what's actually interacting with the flavors that we're bringing from the ground coffee to the brewed coffee is the mineral content in the water. So coffee to water ratio is really important. In your French press, we have a scoop. It says 7 grams or 0.25 ounces per cup. This is a 3-cup French press. So we're going to use our scoop, leveled off scoops, 3 scoops. 3 cups, 3 scoops. Now, I wouldn't be a coffee nerd if I didn't tell you, when they say cup in coffee cups, it's 5 ounces. And that's weird, but that's what it is. So I don't even, when they say coffee cup, it's strange. Or a 12-cup brewer is 60 ounces.
Not literally, but
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
we've got a couple questions.
Yes.
First one, how have people's palates changed over the years in relation to coffee, and how much has this changed the coffees that we see at stores today?
Oh, thank you. So, something that I didn't really go over, but is really important to talk about, are the waves of coffee, or how coffee has changed over time. So 1930s and 40s are the first time that the American general population has access to coffee through Folgers and Maxwell House. That becomes the staple until the early 80s, where Schultze opens Starbucks or takes control of Starbucks and makes it go multinational and blows up, large corporation, all these things. And that essentially was an effective commodifying Italian coffee culture and putting it on everyone's corner. So now there's an inextricably linked Italian coffee culture with coffee culture in general. So with that wave, we had emulation of European markets. So really dark roast, really strong. As we've gotten into this more intentional era, we have had the ability to grow upon the historical context of those that came before us, improve upon the science of those that came before us, and arrive at a place where we can have something that's really intentional and all those things. What does that mean? those intentional people have been very successful at making some taste really good, but it's brought us to a much lighter place. So that's why the things have gotten a little different, is like as things have changed and people have gotten more and more, and I don't know if it necessarily has much to do with consumer preferences, because 80% of consumers like dark roasts, but there's a 20% high echelon consumer base that very much inspires this highly intentional but highly lightly roasted type of thing, which is totally valid and awesome. But I think it's really fun to have all of the spectrum and talk about how it's good and it's good. So that's just where I'm at. That good?
Yep.
I'm sorry. I'll always over answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
So now we got 3 scoops. I have a fancy kettle. You by no means have to use a fancy kettle. If you bring your water up to a boil and then take it off the boil for about 30 seconds, that's probably good. 200-degree water is what I shoot for. The range can be anywhere from 185 up to 205. So pretty big range. Any of you high altitude people, you probably already know your water boils at a lower temperature. So that can be a little bit tricky. When I was doing a brewing competition in Denver, brewing at 8,000 feet was a bit of a trick. So first thing we're gonna do, we're just gonna eyeball it, no scale. And I do have a timer here that I'm starting. So just a little bit to saturate everything. And then I'm just gonna spin the grounds. You say, why, Sam? We need to saturate everything. If we add hot water to ground coffee, it's going to, the CO2 trapped inside those particles are going to push some stuff out of solution. So after we've done our swirl, then we can pour up to just below the spout. I like to stop right at the ring. This will be about a 1:12 brew ratio. Brew ratio will always depend on your brew method. So quick Google search, ideal brew ratio for given brew method. For drip coffee, it's generally going to be 1:16, 1:18 is the kind of range. 1:12 means more concentrated. And espresso is effectively 1:2. So it's like super concentrated. And so what is going on as we put our plunger on the top? That's to insulate everything. And I push it down to just where it's making contact with the grounds, submerging them all. What this is going to do for us is the first thing that happens when hot water touches ground coffee is the acidity is released into the mixture. If I were to press this right now and dump it out and we were to taste it, it would absolutely taste acidic. So if your coffee tastes acidic, it needs more time. We're going to do a 4-minute brew. Then we're going to taste it. Then we're going to determine, does it need more time next time? That is brewing coffee, is making decisions. Or it's always a trial and error, a taste, but what do I do next time? And that is part of the process. So as it tastes really sweet and balanced, then we know it's spent the right amount of time to get the acidity, but also get the sweetness. And then anybody who's had a nasty, bitter cup of coffee, it spent too long in contact with water. The reason I gave y'all the French press and not some complicated pour over, obviously logistics, but I recommended, right, the French press. But also, you get to control the amount of time it spends in there. So you have the power to control.
We've got a couple more questions popping up.
Let's
here,
go.
I guess, while we wait. Is coffee really healthy for us, or is that marketing fluff?
Oh gosh, I would stay away from all of those like there's a lot of like hysterical marketing about coffee in general where it's like make sure that you know about the dust and the mold in a coffee and it's like that's not like yes, it's a problem at like a or like a poorly run facility, but it's not something that's gonna be a thing. Yeah.
All right, next one. This is from our Hawaiian president.
Oh,
How does
fantastic.
Kona coffee stack up compared to Costa Rican?
Thank you.
Inquiring minds want to
Thank
know.
you. So, as you know, Hawaii, as a where it is and what it is now technically American farmland. So it really is a testament because Kona coffee for every American costs $40 per pound. It really makes one question, why? Why is that coffee more expensive? Because it's grown on American farmland, it's cultivated by American hands, and that's very different from how easy it is to get coffee, cheap labor from the third world. And so Kona coffee in general has a much higher demand because of this very small supply and because of where it comes from, but the altitude makes it taste more like an Indonesian coffee.
Okay.
It's good, but not $40 a pound. That's my assessment. And I've pressed, and we're gonna taste. I'm gonna make my compatriots taste with me. But really and truly, obviously, I give all kinds of stuff. This is very new to me, this kind of virtual cupping, but I really appreciate y'all's time. And I hope you enjoy your new French press and always look online. I'm sending you a few resources, but our website, texascoffeetraders.com, you can find all kinds of stuff. If you're closer to Montana, I don't know where everybody is, but closer to Montana Coffee Traders is our other entity. You can totally buy from them too. It's totally different, but just fun and always just buy local, buy often. Yeah.
So we got two more questions popped up here.
Let's do it.
Can a super automatic achieve good coffee or espresso, or is that cheating, not controllable enough to get that?
It depends on, I would say grind size is the most important thing.
Okay.
There. So if you have to use the right type of coffee. If you're using a light roast in a super automatic, it's literally not going to work because it doesn't get hot enough and it doesn't provide enough action to get the flavors out. Since it's so dense, it doesn't want to give the flavors. Okay. So use a light or a medium roast, that kind of thing. Grind a little finer.
Okay. And then Bo is asking, I've been told by his better half to always taste a roasted bean before buying premium coffee. Is this a legit method for determining how the coffee will taste after brewing?
I would actually encourage you, if you have access to the physical beans, crack one under your nose instead. I have witnessed, because I roast coffee as well, I've witnessed my roast team pull coffee out of the tray and eat it, and I'm just like, man, that is, and I tried it, and I like, just got powder to the back of the throat. But if you like that, by all means, that's a great way, because it is expressing all that aroma trapped inside. Yeah.
And then can you talk about, is there such thing as non-organic coffee?
Yeah, so we also buy conventional coffee.
Okay.
We also buy coffee that is not certified organic, that is not certified fair trade. That doesn't mean that we're not paying fair trade prices for it. It means that the farmer and those who cultivated it aren't able to access the capital with which to become certified organic. So that's kind of the thing, is like stipulations, those kinds of things. It can be very expensive, especially as a smallholder, to achieve those certifications, if that makes sense. Yep.
Are they really doing anything to make it inorganic?
No, I mean, probably pesticides or like I would say, if that's a concern for you, only buy fair trade organic.
Have you ever had a good cup of freeze-dried coffee?
It would be way too Taylor County Jail. No, I'm just kidding.
Nice. All right, I think we are out of time here.
Thank you guys so much.
Yes, thank you guys. Looking forward to our next session. See y'all in a little bit.